The restaurant was always loud in the evenings. Plates clinked, chairs scraped against the floor, and voices blended into a constant hum that never really stopped. She moved through it all quickly, balancing heavy trays with careful hands, her steps steady from years of practice. To everyone around her, she was just another waitress doing her job. Polite, quiet, and efficient. Customers noticed her only when they needed something, and even then, it was usually just a quick glance or a short thank you before their attention returned to their food or conversations. She didn't mind being unnoticed. In fact, she had gotten used to it. Every day followed almost the same routine. She would arrive early, tie her apron, and check the tables. Then the rush would begin. Orders, refills, cleaning spills, smiling even when she felt tired. It all became a rhythm she could follow without thinking too much. Her coworkers often joked loudly in the kitchen or complained about difficult customers, but she mostly stayed quiet, listening more than speaking. There was a calmness in her silence, something that made her seem distant, though she was simply saving her energy. Sometimes, when the restaurant slowed down for just a moment, she would pause near the corner where an old piano stood. It wasn't there for decoration alone. On special nights, someone would come in to play while guests enjoyed their meals. But most days, the piano sat untouched, its surface slightly dusty, its keys hidden beneath a closed lid. She always looked at it for a second longer than necessary. There was something about it that pulled her attention, like a quiet voice calling out to her. But she never walked closer when others were around. She would just take a small breath, then turn away and continue working, as if nothing had happened. No one knew what that piano meant to her. After her shift ended, when the restaurant lights dimmed and the last customer left, she would head home slowly. Her body felt heavy from hours of standing, but her mind would start to feel lighter. The noise of the restaurant faded behind her, replaced by the softer sounds of the night. Distant traffic, quiet footsteps, and the occasional breeze brushing past. Her home was small and simple. The walls were plain, and the furniture was worn but clean. In the corner of the room stood an old piano. It wasn't perfect. Some keys were slightly off and a few made softer sounds than they should. But to her, it was more valuable than anything else she owned. This was where her real world began. She would sit down quietly, as if she didn't want to disturb the silence too suddenly. For a moment, she would just rest her hands in her lap, letting the day slowly slip away. Then, gently, she would place her fingers on the keys. The first notes were always soft, not because she lacked confidence, but because she respected the moment. After hours of noise, she wanted to create something calm, something meaningful. As she continued playing, the music would grow stronger, filling the small room with emotion. It was the only time she truly felt seen, even if no one else was there. Music was not just a hobby for her. It was a part of who she was. She had not learned in a big school or from expensive teachers. Most of what she knew came from watching videos, listening carefully, and practicing again and again. There were times when she made mistakes, times when she felt frustrated, but she never stopped. Each wrong note became a lesson, and each small improvement gave her hope. Even on the hardest days, when her feet ached and her back hurt, she still found her way to the piano. It was her escape. At work, she followed orders. At home, she created something of her own. There were nights when she played for hours without realizing how much time had passed. The music would carry her thoughts far away from her daily struggles. In those moments, she was no longer a waitress rushing between tables. She was someone with a voice, someone who could tell a story without speaking a single word. But this part of her life stayed hidden. She never talked about it with her coworkers. It wasn't that she didn't trust them. She just didn't think they would understand. To them, she was the quiet one who worked hard and kept to herself. Telling them about her music felt risky, like opening a door that might lead to laughter or disbelief. So she kept it private. One evening, as she wiped down a table near closing time, she overheard a group of customers talking about music. They were discussing performances, famous pianists, and how difficult it was to play with true emotion. One of them said something that stayed in her mind. "Anyone can press keys," the person said. But not everyone can make you feel something. She didn't react, but inside, those words settled deeply. Later that night, when she sat at her piano, she thought about it again. She didn't want to just play notes. She wanted to create feeling, to make someone pause and truly listen. That idea pushed her to practice even more carefully, focusing not just on technique, but on emotion. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Her routine never changed on the outside. She was still the same waitress, moving through crowded tables, unnoticed by most. But inside, something was growing stronger. Her confidence. It was quiet just like her, but it was there. Sometimes, she would imagine what it would feel like to play in front of others. The thought made her nervous, but also excited. She pictured a room full of people, the sound of a piano filling the air, and for once, everyone listening. Not because they needed something, but because they wanted to hear. Then she would shake the thought away. It felt too far from her reality. For now, her small room was enough. Her late-night practice was enough. The feeling she got when she played was enough. But deep down, a small part of her wondered if life had something more waiting for her. She didn't chase that thought. She didn't make big plans or bold decisions. She simply kept going, one day at a time, holding on to her quiet dream while the world around her remained unaware. Back at the restaurant, the piano in the corner continued to sit untouched most days. Customers passed by it without a second glance. Workers cleaned around it without thinking much about it. But for her, it was never just a piece of furniture. It was a reminder of who she was beyond the apron, beyond the long hours, beyond the noise. And even though no one else noticed, something about her had already begun to change. The girl who once played only to escape was slowly becoming someone who could one day be heard. Her mornings always began before the sun fully rose. The small room she lived in would still be dim, with only a faint light slipping through the window. She would sit up slowly, giving herself a moment before the day started. There was no alarm clock needed anymore. Her body had learned this routine so well that it woke her at the same time every day. She didn't rush. There was no point in rushing when every day followed almost the same path. She would fold her blanket neatly, wash her face, and prepare something simple to eat. Most mornings it was just tea and a small piece of bread. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her going. Money had always been tight. That was nothing new. Growing up, she had learned early that not everything she wanted could be hers. While others talked about plans for school, hobbies, and dreams, she spent more time thinking about how to help at home. There were bills to pay, responsibilities to carry, and not enough hands to handle everything. So she stepped in without complaining. She left school earlier than she had hoped. It wasn't because she didn't care about learning. In fact, she loved it. But life didn't give her many choices. Work became more important than books, and earning became more urgent than dreaming. Still, one thing stayed with her: music. Even when everything else felt uncertain, music gave her something steady to hold on to. She didn't have a teacher guiding her or a proper place to learn. Instead, she found small ways to teach herself. Sometimes she would listen to songs over and over again, trying to understand how each note fit together. Other times, she would watch free lessons whenever she could, carefully observing hand movements and trying to copy them later. It wasn't easy. There were many moments when she felt stuck. Her fingers wouldn't move the way she wanted. Certain pieces felt too difficult. And without anyone to correct her, she often didn't know if she was doing things the right way. But she didn't let that stop her. She kept trying. That was something she had learned from life itself. When things became difficult, stopping wasn't an option. You just kept going even if progress felt slow. At work, her struggles were invisible. Customers saw her carrying plates, refilling glasses, and cleaning tables. They didn't see the hours she spent practicing at night or the effort she put into improving herself quietly. To them, she was just doing her job. Sometimes the job was harder than usual. There were days when customers spoke harshly, as if she didn't deserve respect. Some ignored her completely, talking over her or treating her like she wasn't even there. At first, those moments hurt. But over time, she learned to stay calm, to respond politely, and to move on. She couldn't control how others behaved, but she could control how she reacted. Her coworkers had their own ways of dealing with stress. Some would complain loudly, others would argue, and a few simply didn't care anymore. She was different. She carried her thoughts quietly, letting them settle instead of letting them spill out. But that didn't mean she didn't feel anything. There were nights when she returned home more tired than usual, her body aching and her mind heavy. On those nights, even walking to the piano felt like a challenge. She would sit down slowly, staring at the keys, unsure if she had the energy to play. Yet somehow she always did, even if it was just for a few minutes. And almost every time something changed. The tiredness didn't disappear completely, but it became lighter. The stress didn't vanish, but it became easier to carry. The music had a way of reaching places inside her that nothing else could. It reminded her that she was more than her struggles. One evening, after a particularly long shift, she noticed something different at the restaurant. A group of well-dressed guests had gathered near the piano. They spoke confidently, laughing and discussing music in a way that felt distant from her world. One of them played a few notes, then stopped, shaking their head as if it wasn't good enough. She watched from a distance while cleaning a table. There was a strange feeling in her chest. Not jealousy, not exactly. It was something quieter, something deeper. Question, maybe, what would it feel like to sit there without fear? She quickly looked away, returning to her work. Thoughts like that felt dangerous. They pulled her toward something she wasn't sure she could reach. Later that night, at home, she played longer than usual. Her fingers moved faster, stronger, more certain. It was as if everything she had been holding inside, the exhaustion, the quiet hopes, the unanswered questions, was flowing through the music. Each note carried emotion. Each pause held meaning. She didn't need an audience to feel it. But deep down, she wondered if one day someone else might. Time passed and her skills continued to grow. She became more confident with difficult pieces, her hands moving smoothly across the keys. She started to experiment, adding her own touch to the music instead of simply copying what she had learned. That was when something new began to form. Her own style. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't polished in the way trained musicians might expect. But it was real. It came from her experiences, her emotions, her journey, and that gave it a kind of beauty that couldn't be taught. Still, she kept it hidden. At the restaurant, nothing changed on the surface. She was still the quiet waitress who did her job without drawing attention. The piano in the corner remained closed most of the time, waiting for special occasions that rarely came. But every time she passed by it, her steps slowed just a little. It was becoming harder to ignore. One night, as she prepared to leave, she found herself alone in the dining area. The lights were dim, and the usual noise was gone. The piano stood quietly in its place, untouched, almost as if it was waiting. She looked around. No one was there. For a moment, her heart began to beat faster. Her mind filled with hesitation. What if someone walked in? What if she made a mistake? What if she wasn't as good as she believed? But then another thought came. What if she was? She took a small step closer. Then another. Her hand slowly reached out, touching the surface of the piano. It felt cool and real beneath her fingers. She hesitated for a second, then gently lifted the lid. The keys were right in front of her. She sat down carefully, her breath slightly uneven. The room felt different now, quieter than ever. For a moment, she just sat there, letting the silence settle. Then, softly, she placed her fingers on the keys. The first note echoed through the empty space. It was simple, but it carried something powerful. She played a few more notes, then paused, listening to the sound fade. There was no audience, no pressure, no expectations. Just her and the music. A small smile appeared on her face. It didn't last long, but it was real. After a few minutes, she closed the piano gently and stood up. Her heart was still beating fast, but there was also a new feeling growing inside her. Something had changed. It was a small moment, one that no one else had seen. But for her, it meant everything. For the first time, the distance between her hidden world and her everyday life didn't feel so large. And even though she didn't know it yet, that small step would lead to something much bigger than she ever imagined. The evening started like any other, but there was a different kind of energy in the air. From the moment she stepped into the restaurant, she could feel it. The tables were arranged more neatly than usual, soft lights were placed around the room, and fresh flowers had been set on every table. Even the staff seemed more alert, moving faster, speaking in lower tones, as if something important was about to happen. She tied her apron and quietly observed everything around her. It didn't take long to understand. There was a special event that night. Guests began arriving earlier than usual. They were dressed more formally, speaking in calm but confident voices. Some looked around with interest, others focused only on their seats. The atmosphere felt different from the usual busy evenings. It was more organized, more controlled, but also more demanding. The manager walked back and forth, checking every detail. Nothing could go wrong tonight. She stayed focused on her work, greeting guests politely, taking orders, and making sure everything was in place. Even though the environment felt more intense, she kept her calm. Years of experience had taught her how to move through pressure without letting it show on her face. Still, something kept pulling her attention toward the piano. It stood in its usual place, but tonight it looked different. The lid was open, and a small light above it made the keys shine softly. A chair had been placed neatly in front of it, ready for someone to sit and play. She knew that a pianist had been invited for the event. For a moment, her steps slowed as she passed by. She didn't stop, but her eyes lingered on the piano just a little longer than usual. Then she moved on, reminding herself that tonight was not about her. She had work to do. Time passed quickly as the restaurant filled up. Orders came in one after another. Glasses needed refilling, plates needed clearing, and guests needed attention. The noise level rose, though it was still more controlled than on normal nights. Then something unexpected happened. The manager suddenly appeared near the staff area, his expression tense. He spoke quickly with another worker, his voice low but urgent. She couldn't hear everything, but one word stood out clearly. Delayed. A small wave of confusion spread among the staff. The pianist hadn't arrived. At first, it didn't seem like a big problem. People assumed it was just a matter of time. But as minutes passed, the tension grew. Guests began to notice that something was missing. The piano sat there, ready, but silent. Some guests glanced at it, then at each other, quietly wondering what was going on. The manager checked his phone again and again, pacing slightly now. The calm control he had earlier was starting to slip. This event had been carefully planned, and the music was an important part of it. Without it, something felt incomplete. She noticed all of this while continuing her work. She carried trays, served dishes, and responded to guests, but her mind kept returning to the same thought. The piano was still silent. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it wasn't her place to think about it. But the longer the silence lasted, the harder it became to push the thought away. Finally, the manager spoke again, this time louder. "He's not coming," he said, frustration clear in his voice. The words settled heavily in the room. Now it was a real problem. Without music, the event would feel incomplete. The atmosphere would change. Guests might lose interest, and the carefully planned evening could fall apart. For a moment, no one knew what to do. She stood near the side, holding an empty tray, watching everything quietly. Her mind was racing, but her body remained still. A thought kept returning, stronger each time. You can do it. But along with it came doubt. What if you make a mistake? What if they laugh? What if you're not good enough? Her grip tightened slightly on the tray. This wasn't like playing at home. This wasn't even like those few quiet moments when she played in the empty restaurant. This would be different. There would be people watching, listening, judging. Her heart pounded louder. She looked at the piano again. It seemed closer now, almost as if it was calling her. Then she looked at the manager. He was still trying to think of a solution, his face tense, his movements restless. She took a small breath, then another. Before she could change her mind, she stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but clear enough to be heard. I can play. The words felt strange as they left her mouth, as if they didn't belong to her. The manager turned to look at her, surprised. For a second, he didn't say anything. His eyes searched her face, trying to understand if she was serious. Some of the other staff members looked over too. There was a brief silence. Then someone gave a small, uncertain laugh, thinking she was joking. But she didn't laugh. She stood there, still and steady, even though her heart was racing inside her chest. I can play, she repeated, a little more firmly this time. The manager hesitated. You? He asked, not unkindly but clearly unsure. She nodded. Another moment of silence passed. This was not part of the plan. Letting a waitress perform in front of guests at a formal event was risky. Could go wrong in many ways. But there were no other options. The manager looked toward the dining area, then back at her. He was running out of time. Finally, he sighed. Just keep it simple, he said. It wasn't full confidence, but it was permission. Her heart skipped a beat. She nodded again, trying to stay calm, even though everything inside her felt like it was moving too fast. She placed her tray aside carefully. Each step toward the piano felt heavier than the last. The room seemed quieter now, even though people were still talking. A few guests began to notice her movement, their eyes following her with mild curiosity. Who was she? Why was a waitress walking toward the piano? She could feel the attention growing, and with it, her nervousness. Her hands felt slightly cold, and her breathing became uneven. For a brief moment, she thought about turning back, but she didn't. She reached the piano and stood beside it. Up close, it looked even more real, more important. This wasn't just an object anymore. It was a chance, a risk. She slowly pulled the chair and sat down. The room didn't go completely silent, but the noise softened. Conversations lowered just a little as more people noticed her. She placed her hands in her lap, taking a second to steady herself. Her thoughts were loud. Don't mess this up. Stay calm. You've done this before. But then another thought came, quieter than the rest. Just play. She lifted her hands and placed her fingers on the keys. They trembled slightly. For a second, she froze. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. The eyes, the expectations, the fear. It all came rushing in at once. Then she closed her eyes briefly. She remembered her small room, her old piano, the quiet nights, the feeling of playing without fear. She took a slow breath. And then she began. The first note was soft, almost too soft, but it was enough. It echoed gently through the room, reaching ears that weren't expecting anything special. A few more notes followed, still simple, still careful, but steady. She didn't rush. She didn't try to impress right away. She let the music grow naturally, just like she always did at home. And as her fingers began to move more freely, something started to change. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it loosened its hold. The piano no longer felt like a test, felt like home. And for the first time in that room full of people, she wasn't just a waitress. She was someone about to be heard. The moment she began to play, everything around her felt different. At first, the sound was soft and uncertain, almost like she was testing the air itself. Her fingers moved carefully, pressing each key with a kind of hesitation that came from being watched so closely. The room didn't become silent, but the noise started to fade little by little, as if people were slowly noticing something unusual happening. She kept her eyes on the keys. Looking up felt too heavy, too risky. She could feel the presence of people around her, sitting at tables, holding glasses, waiting. Some were still talking quietly, but even their voices seemed weaker now, as if the music was gently pushing them into the background. Her hands trembled slightly, not because she didn't know what to play, but because she knew too well what this moment meant. This wasn't her room anymore. This wasn't practice in silence. This was real. Every note mattered now. She took a small breath and continued. The melody slowly became clearer. Her fingers started to remember what they had done so many times before in private. The movements became smoother, less forced. It was as if her body was beginning to trust itself again. Still, doubt stayed close. What if they didn't like it? What if she made a mistake in front of everyone? What if this was a bad idea? Those thoughts tried to rise, but she pushed them back gently, focusing instead on the rhythm. One note at a time. One moment at a time. A few guests turned their heads fully now. Some who were eating paused mid-bite. Others leaned slightly forward, trying to understand what they were hearing. There was confusion at first. It wasn't what they expected from a sudden replacement. But something in the music made them stay. She didn't notice this right away. Her world had narrowed down to the piano, to the movement of her hands, to the sound filling the space. Everything else felt distant. Then something changed. The melody shifted. It became more confident, more flowing. The hesitation in her fingers started to disappear. It was still not perfect, but it carried emotion. Real emotion. The kind that couldn't be taught quickly or faked easily. The room grew quieter. Not completely silent, but noticeably calmer. Even the staff who were still moving around slowed down slightly, sensing the change in atmosphere. Some glanced toward the piano with surprise. They were used to seeing her carry plates, not create music that filled the entire room. She still didn't look up, but she could feel it. The attention was no longer casual. It was focused. That feeling should have made her more nervous. And in a way, it did. But something else was growing too. A strange sense of connection, like the music was finally reaching where it was supposed to go. Her shoulders relaxed just a little. Her breathing steadied. The notes became smoother. Inside her, memories began to mix with the music. Long nights at home. Tired evenings after work. Moments when she doubted herself but still sat down to practice anyway. All of it started to flow through her hands without her forcing it. This wasn't just performance. It was expression. A few guests now stopped talking completely. Forks were set down. Glasses remained untouched. People who had been distracted just moments ago were now fully paying attention. She still didn't see their faces clearly, but she felt the shift. The energy in the room had changed. At first, some had expected a simple, maybe even average attempt. After all, she was just a waitress stepping into something unfamiliar. That was the assumption. But the music didn't match that expectation. It grew richer with every passing moment. Her fingers moved more freely now, no longer stiff or afraid. The piano responded to her as if it had been waiting for her touch all along. Each note carried something deeper than technique. Carried feeling. Still, she reminded herself not to rush. Stay steady. Don't break the flow. Keep going. Her mind stayed focused, even as emotions tried to rise. Then, for a brief moment, her hand slipped slightly on a transition. A note came out softer than intended. Her heart jumped. A mistake. It felt loud to her, even if it wasn't obvious to others. Her instinct was to panic, to stop, to fix it immediately. But she didn't. Instead, she adjusted. She continued the melody naturally, blending the moment into the flow as if it was always meant to be there. And surprisingly, the music didn't collapse. Continued smoothly. That small recovery gave her something important. Confidence. She realized something simple but powerful. Perfection wasn't what mattered. Connection was. And somehow, the audience didn't seem to notice the mistake the way she did. Or if they did, it didn't matter to them. They were still listening, still drawn in. The tension in her chest eased slightly. She kept playing. Now the music carried more strength. It wasn't just soft emotion anymore. It had structure, direction, movement. It felt like a story unfolding without words. A few guests exchanged quiet glances. This wasn't what they expected at all. Some leaned back in their chairs, surprised. Others leaned forward, as if trying to understand how someone they had barely noticed earlier could create something like this. But she didn't see any of it clearly. Her focus stayed on the piano. She began to lose track of time. Seconds felt longer. The room felt both close and distant at the same time. It was as if she had stepped into a space where only the music existed. Her hands no longer trembled. They moved with purpose. The fear that had been so strong earlier was still there, somewhere in the background, but it no longer controlled her. She was playing now, not surviving. At one point, she added a small variation, something she had never fully planned before. It came naturally, as if the music itself was guiding her. A gentle change in rhythm, a slightly different flow. Surprised even her. But she kept it. And it worked. The sound became richer, more expressive. A quiet shift passed through the room again. Not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. Like a shared realization spreading slowly among the guests. This was not ordinary. Somewhere near the back, a few people stopped completely to listen. Conversations had fully disappeared now. Even those who had not been paying attention earlier were now watching the piano. The atmosphere had transformed. She still didn't look up, but she felt it. She felt the attention. She felt the silence. She felt the change she had created without meaning to. And for the first time since she sat down, she allowed herself a small thought. Maybe this was where she was supposed to be. The music continued to rise gently, carrying her forward, step by step, note by note. And as it did, the room that once saw her only as a waitress was beginning to see something completely different. The room had changed without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. It was not sudden. It was not loud. It was a slow shift, like water turning still after a storm. One moment there had been soft talking, the clinking of glasses, the quiet movement of staff between tables. And the next, all of that had faded into something distant. Now there was only the piano. She didn't know how long she had been playing. Time no longer felt normal. It stretched and bent in strange ways, as if every note added another layer to the moment. Her fingers moved with more confidence now, no longer searching for the right place but already knowing where to go. What had started as fear had turned into focus. And what had started as hesitation had turned into flow. She still didn't look up. Her eyes stayed on the keys, but she could feel everything around her. The presence of people, the stillness, the attention that had slowly gathered like a quiet wave. It was no longer a restaurant in her mind. It was something else, something larger, something that felt alive in a different way. The music grew richer, deeper, not louder in volume, but stronger in feeling. Each note seemed to carry more weight, as if it was telling something important without using words. Somewhere in the room, a fork was set down gently. Then another. A glass stopped halfway to someone's lips and stayed there. No one wanted to interrupt the moment anymore. Even those who had been skeptical at first were now completely still. The idea that this was just a waitress filling in no longer made sense. That thought had slowly disappeared, replaced by something harder to explain. She was still just herself. But something in her playing made it feel like she was more. Her hands moved across the keys with growing ease. The piano, once intimidating under the bright lights and the weight of eyes watching her, now felt familiar. Almost like it was responding to her instead of being controlled by her. There was a small moment when she felt the emotion rise again. Not fear this time. Something softer. Something heavier. She had never expected this to happen. Not tonight. Not here. Not like this. When she stepped forward earlier, it had been out of necessity more than courage. A solution to a problem she didn't want to let fail. But now it was no longer about fixing a situation. It was about expression. The melody shifted again, flowing into something more emotional. A few notes lingered longer than usual, as if they were holding onto something unseen. The room seemed to breathe with it, and for the first time she felt something change inside her. Not just in the music, in herself. She was no longer thinking about mistakes, no longer thinking about being watched. She was simply playing. And the more she played, the more the world around her disappeared. The restaurant, the tables, the guests, the staff. All of it blurred into the background until only the piano mattered. She didn't realize that some people were now fully turned toward her, watching without blinking. Some leaned forward slightly, as if afraid they might miss even a single note. Others had completely stopped what they were doing. The room had become quiet in a way that felt unusual for such a busy place. Not empty, just focused. At one point, she reached a passage that required more strength. Her hands moved faster, the rhythm building slightly. There was intensity now, but still control. She wasn't rushing. She was guiding the music forward. And then something unexpected happened. A soft wave of emotion passed through her. It wasn't planned. It wasn't practiced. It simply came. For a brief second, her vision blurred slightly. Not from tears falling, but from feeling something too strong to ignore. She quickly steadied herself, taking a deeper breath without stopping the music. She didn't break. She continued, and somehow that moment made the performance even stronger. The audience didn't see the struggle inside her. They only heard the result, and what they heard stayed with them. A few people exchanged small looks of surprise. Not loud reactions, just quiet understanding passing between them. Something unusual was happening in front of them, and they all felt it at the same time. She still didn't know that. She was still inside the music, inside her own world. The melody softened again, becoming smoother, gentler. It felt like the music was now telling two stories at once. One of quiet struggle, and one of rising strength. Her fingers slowed slightly, not because she was tired, but because the moment required it. She was no longer just playing notes. She was shaping emotion. A subtle silence followed a soft phrase. Not empty silence. The kind that holds meaning. The kind that makes people hold their breath without realizing it. And in that silence, something powerful happened. The audience leaned in even more. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room seemed to be waiting for what would come next. She felt it too, even without looking up. That pressure, that attention, that expectation. But instead of breaking her, it grounded her. She continued, carefully, strongly, and then the music began to rise again. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily, like something building from within. Her hands moved with more confidence than ever before. The fear that had once been so strong at the beginning of the night felt far away now. Not gone completely, but no longer in control. What remained was clarity and connection. At one point, she slightly tilted her head, still not looking at the audience, but feeling their presence in a different way. It was no longer pressure. It was energy, something shared, something unspoken. The piano responded beautifully under her hands. Even the small imperfections of the instrument no longer mattered. In fact, they almost added character to the sound. The music was not perfect, but it was real, and that reality made it powerful. A few guests at the back of the room, who had been casually talking earlier, were now completely silent. One by one, conversations had disappeared across the space until nothing remained except the performance. Even the staff had stopped moving for a moment. No trays, no orders, no distractions. Just listening. She didn't know that she had completely captured the room. She only knew the music was flowing, and she was still inside it. As she moved into the final section of the piece, something shifted again. The melody became more controlled, more delicate, like it was preparing to land somewhere important. Her breathing slowed slightly. Her fingers softened their movement. Each note now felt intentional, carefully placed, as if nothing could be wasted. And then, gradually, the music began to settle. The energy that had risen earlier started to come down gently, like waves returning to shore after building strength. She guided it without thinking too much. It felt natural now, as if the piano itself knew where it needed to end. The final notes were softer than everything before them. Careful, light, and then, silence. She held her hands above the keys for a moment longer, as if making sure the sound had truly ended. The room did not react immediately. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone needed a moment to understand what they had just heard. She slowly lowered her hands into her lap. Her heart was still beating fast, but differently now. Not from fear, from something else. And in that quiet pause, before anything else could happen, she finally realized one simple truth. The room was no longer looking at a waitress. They were looking at her. The silence after the final note felt heavier than anything she had experienced that night. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was full of attention, full of emotion, full of something that no one in the room seemed ready to break. She kept her hands resting in her lap, still sitting at the piano, unsure of what should come next. Her heart was beating fast, but her body felt strangely still, like she had used up all her strength in the music and now had nothing left to offer except quiet breathing. For a moment, nothing happened. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire room was holding on to the ending, afraid that even a small sound might disturb what they had just experienced. Then it began. It was not loud at first, just a single clap from somewhere in the room. Then another, and another. Slowly, like a wave spreading across water, the sound grew. Clapping filled the space, building gently but steadily until it turned into a full applause. She blinked in surprise. This was not what she had expected. Not at all. She had imagined maybe polite reactions, maybe a few nods, maybe quiet appreciation. But this was different. People were not just clapping out of manners. They were clapping because they wanted to. Some guests even stood up. One by one, chairs moved back, and more people rose to their feet. The sound of applause became stronger, filling every corner of the restaurant. It wasn't just loud. It was warm. It carried something deeper than simple approval. Carried respect. She slowly looked up for the first time. Her eyes met the room she had been avoiding all evening, and what she saw made her freeze for a second. People were looking at her. Not the way they looked at a waitress earlier in the night. Not with passing attention or casual interest. This time, their eyes were focused, bright, and full of surprise. Some were smiling. Some looked almost emotional, as if they had been unexpectedly touched by something they didn't know they needed. She didn't know how to respond. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap, unsure whether she should stand or stay seated. She had never been the center of attention like this before. It felt unreal, like she had stepped into someone else's moment. The manager was standing near the side of the room. At first, his expression was unreadable. He had been tense earlier, worried about the missing pianist, worried about the event falling apart. Now he was simply watching her. Then, slowly, his expression changed. The tension in his face softened. There was surprise, yes, but also something else. Recognition. He gave a small nod, almost as if he was accepting something he hadn't expected to see. She slowly stood up. Her legs felt a little unsteady, not from weakness, but from emotion. She stepped slightly away from the piano, unsure of where to place her hands, how to stand, how to accept what was happening around her. The applause continued, even louder now. She looked across the room again, and for the first time she saw faces clearly. Not just guests, but people who had been strangers only minutes ago. Now they looked connected by a shared experience. Some were still clapping. Some had stopped clapping but were still watching. And all of them were focused on her. Her throat felt tight. She wanted to say something, but no words came out. What could she even say in a moment like this? Thank you didn't feel enough. Sorry didn't make sense. So she simply stood there, letting the moment exist without trying to control it. After a while, the applause slowly began to settle. Not stop completely, just soften. People started to return to their seats, though many still kept their attention on her. Conversations slowly returned, but they were different now. Quieter, more thoughtful, as if everyone had just experienced something they would not forget easily. The manager finally walked toward her. His steps were slower than before, less rushed. He stopped a short distance away, looking at her for a moment before speaking. You didn't tell us you could play like that, he said. His voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't critical. It sounded more like someone trying to understand something unexpected. She looked down slightly. I didn't think it mattered, she said quietly. There was honesty in her voice, a simple truth. He nodded slowly, as if accepting that answer. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant had returned to its usual noise, but it felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted. Even the staff seemed more aware of her presence. She wasn't just moving through tables anymore. People noticed her now, not as a waitress, but as someone who had just changed the mood of an entire room. After a few seconds, the manager spoke again. "That was supposed to be the highlight of tonight," he said. "And you made it better than we planned." She didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply gave a small, uncertain nod. He gestured gently toward the piano. "You can go back to your work," he said, though his tone carried something softer now. "We'll handle things from here." She hesitated. Her eyes moved briefly toward the piano again. It still stood there, quiet now, no longer carrying the sound she had filled it with. But it didn't feel the same as before. It felt like it had become part of something bigger. Something that had just changed her life in a small but real way. She slowly stepped away. As she walked back toward the staff area, she felt something unfamiliar inside her. It wasn't excitement alone. It wasn't fear anymore either. It was awareness. Like she had stepped out of a shadow she didn't fully realize she had been standing in. The other staff members looked at her differently now. Some with surprise. Some with admiration they didn't try to hide. A few smiled at her in a quiet way, as if they were still processing what they had just seen. No one made jokes. No one dismissed it. Even those who had been skeptical earlier were silent now. She picked up her tray again, but it felt lighter than before. Not physically, but emotionally. As if something inside her had shifted just enough to change how she carried herself. She continued working, serving guests, clearing tables, but everything felt slightly different. People looked at her more often now. Some gave small nods. Some whispered quietly after she passed. She didn't know what they were saying, but she didn't feel uncomfortable anymore. There was a calmness growing inside her. Later, when things slowed down, she stepped aside for a moment and glanced back toward the piano. It was empty again, but not forgotten. She realized something then. For a long time, she had thought of music as something she kept hidden. Something separate from her life. Something private, almost secret. But tonight had changed that. It was no longer just hers. It had reached others. Touched others. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if this would lead to something bigger or if life would return to normal again. But something had already changed that could not be undone. She had been seen. Not just as someone working quietly in the background, but as someone who could create something meaningful. As the night slowly came to an end, she finished her shift like she always did. Cleaning tables, stacking chairs, preparing the space for closing. But even in those familiar actions, there was a quiet difference. She was no longer just going through the motions. Something inside her had awakened. And as she stepped out of the restaurant that night, into the calm air outside, she didn't feel the same as she had when she entered. The world was still the same, but she wasn't. And somewhere deep inside her, a small but steady thought remained. This is not the end. This is just the beginning.